Hello and welcome to Rolling in Mills. Avatar: The Last Airbender is brilliant. I don't know how else to say it. Its animation is stunning, its characters complex, its action interesting, its world rich, and its story intriguing. It's my all-time favourite show, even if it isn't objectively the best thing I've seen. There are so many things you could talk about with this show, but I've decided to just focus on one very specific element: power crawl. What is power crawl, you may ask? Well, power crawl, or power creep as it's sometimes referred to as, is basically the speed and force in which a character's strength increases throughout an action serial. So basically how powerful a character is at the beginning of a series, how powerful they are at the end, and how quickly they get there. But this doesn't necessarily have to be fighting ability. As a whole, it's a need for things to be bigger and better than they were before, for there to be a constant sense of tension and escalation. You see it all the time in capitalism, and it's the reason something like the 4 and 20 meat pizza pie exists. Avatar is a great example because it's both a fantastic show and it handles power crawl perfectly. But more importantly, its sister show The Legend of Korra is an example of poor power crawl, while using the same mechanics that the original series had. This means it's way easier to see what's right or wrong instead of comparing two completely different shows. So what makes Avatar's power crawl so great? Well, for one, the entire plot of the series was planned from the get-go, meaning that the writers knew exactly how much of Aang's power would grow and how they could spread it across the entire series. Plus, the progression of Aang's power is directly tied to both his character and the plot. Aang must master all 4 elements and defeat the Fire Lord. Once this is achieved, the series ends. Simple. And that's not to say that this is some perfect method or something, because it's one of the most simple. It's how you handle it in an overarching story that counts. So Avatar follows a really standard 3-act structure for both its seasons and episodes. The first act is to set up the plot and characters, the second act is the action and conflict, and the third act is the climax and resolution. The tension increases until the end of the second act when the main character is at their lowest point, forcing them to rise for the third act and overcome their foe. The low point and climax are most important here, as it's where both the character and power usually grow. Take Book 1 for example. The plot increases in tension until everything starts to fall apart. Shao kills the moon spirit and thus the waterbenders are powerless, Katara is defeated by Zuko, and Aang is nowhere to be found. The resolution is a rise from this low point. Iroh fends off Zhao and rebirths the moon spirit through Yue's sacrifice, Aang enters the Avatar state and destroys the Fire Nation Brigade, and Zuko defeats Zhao.
It can't be!
The plot has ended nicely on a high note and the season is over. Aang doesn't really change and power is just given to him, but that's a complaint for another day. As with the low point, this should also be reflected across the 3 seasons of the show, in the same way that the 3-act structure can be applied to single episodes. This means that you have dips and climaxes within episodes, seasons, and series. And this is why the second entry into a trilogy is usually the darkest, because it ends with the heroes at their lowest point. Empire Strikes Back is probably the most famous example of this, but Avatar does it as well with its second season. But that's not to say that this method is perfect, because it also relies heavily on self-restraint in a fully planned series. Let's look at Naruto, for example. This uses the same basic structure. Characters get stronger as they train, they fight the antagonist and come close to losing, but they miraculously gain new power, oftentimes through the power of friendship, and defeat the antagonist. Rinse and repeat. But that's the issue, rinsing and repeating too many times, because it starts to beg the question, what next? You defeated this antagonist, so what's next? Oh, defeat another antagonist through another power-up, and another, and another. And this is okay for some time, but soon the wound begins to fester. There's this trend I like to call the PowerPoint. No, not that PowerPoint. Nope, not that one either. It's where the power of a character can only grow to a certain degree before it becomes boring to watch, or it's simply impractical. Let's go back to Naruto, for example. The show starts with hand-to-hand combat and some light magical abilities, because, you know, ninjas are magic. Then we move on to some larger magical abilities, and then larger ones, and then larger ones, and then larger ones, until flaming neon characters are blowing other characters through the moon. Yeah, you know, basic ninja stuff. I think this generally comes down to the purpose of the show though. What drives it? So, what drives Avatar? Aang is the Avatar, and thus it's his responsibility to defeat the Fire Nation and restore balance to the world. To do this, he must master all 4 elements and defeat the Fire Nation. Simple. So what about Naruto? What's the goal here?
To be the greatest Hokage!
A little bit vague, right? And that's how you end up with this shit. Dragon Ball Z has this syndrome as well. There's only so many times someone can go to another Super Saiyan level before it loses all meaning. I mean, I guess Saiyans are so strong now that their hair is blue instead of yellow. Wow, what a concise and meaningful depiction of ability. Taking some inspiration from Mass Effect 3, I see. So what's the power point of Avatar: The Last Airbender? The point in which fighting ability becomes dull within its own universe. Well, I'd say it's the Avatar state, which is why the show ends as soon as Aang is able to fully gain control over it. I mean, who's reasonably going to oppose him at this point? He's basically a god, and any attempt to find someone as strong as him would be contrived, and would force the action to take place on this ridiculously massive scale. You can even see this in the final episode of the series. The fight between Aang and Ozai, despite being the major fight of the entire series, is far less interesting than the beautifully animated and scored Agni Kai between Zuko and Azula. I mean, who cares that Aang can shoot a giant laser beam into the air when this emotionally charged battle is happening only a couple of kilometers away? And on this point, none of this power level shit means anything if your characters suck or the conflicts are contrived. You'd have the best action and power crawl in the world, but no one would care if your characters were planks of wood. Which is kind of where Korra comes in. Sometimes power crawl isn't as simple as, have I passed the power point or not? It can be a little bit more complex. Your hero progressing with their power may be fine, but what sort of opposition are they facing, and what sort of power are they progressing from? It's a little bit easier to show an example of this not working, which is why I'll use Korra. So what is Korra's power like at the beginning of her series? Well, she's mastered fire, water, and earth, but never learned air, which puts her at the exact opposite of where Aang was at the beginning of his series. But it also means that she can't really progress much as the Avatar, considering she only has one more element to learn. But that's fine because Korra was initially intended to only have one season, and Korra gaining airbending and the Avatar state by the end of season 1 grants her the same power point as Aang at the end of his series. But this isn't really what happens. So, you know how I was talking about protagonists passing the power point and their powers becoming so ridiculous that they're boring? Well, this happens pretty commonly with antagonists too. Because these action serial plots generally focus around a protagonist having to get to the power level of the antagonist, it means that the antagonist generally isn't allowed to engage them head on, otherwise they just straight up beat them. Korra does this too. Amon is such an interesting antagonist ideologically, and his power of removing anyone's bending permanently is intriguing and mysterious, but it just can't be used in the show. What happens if Korra fights Amon? Well, she loses her bending permanently, show over, which means we're stuck with fighting faceless goons for the majority of the show, which is not particularly interesting or dynamic. Now, that might sound a little hypocritical since The Last Airbender has Aang fighting moves all the time, but the thing is that Aang can actually fight sub-antagonists like Zuko, Zhao, Ty Lee, and Mei on a regular basis, though arguably Mei's knives never actually stabbing anyone is an example of an unusable ability. Allowing the recurring antagonist to grow stronger with the protagonist is pretty clever, because it means that everyone is evenly matched and the fights are always dynamic, instead of the hero always fighting against the same stagnant antagonist. Point is that it's okay to have characters fighting mooks, as long as it's balanced with some more substantial stuff. So sometimes antagonists have abilities that are too overpowered to use, forcing them out of the show. But it's not like this can't happen to protagonists too. For example, Mako has the ability of lightning through the entirety of Korra, but very, very rarely uses it. Avatar also has lightning, obviously, but it's handled really, really well. Zuko, who is unable to control lightning due to his aggressive personality, is taught how to counter it, which is then taught to Aang, in which it becomes a moral issue for him in his final fight with Ozai. This ability, while extremely powerful and potentially overpowered, is given a reasonable counter that works on a power, plot, and character level. Perfect. In Korra, it's there to look cool, but it's so overpowered that Mako conveniently forgets to use it every time he fights, making it useless on a power, plot, and character level. So let's see a bigger example of Korra failing at this. Korra is given the Avatar state after season 1, which basically makes her a god and puts her on the same level that Aang was at the end of his series. But considering there's 3 more seasons after this, there's a couple of directions you can go, all of which are pretty weak. First option is to completely remove the protagonist's abilities, giving them a clean reset and allowing them to gain their power again over a new season. A lot of video games do this so they don't have to invent new game mechanics and can use the same resources again. Assassin's Creed and Call of Duty have made a fortune out of this. Second option is you water down the overpowered ability, which is what Korra does with the Avatar state. It becomes nothing more than a power boost, and a pretty poor one at that. A far stretch from its godlike aura in Avatar. The third option is to increase the power level of all antagonists in the series, which is what DBZ does pretty commonly. And it's basically just another way of weakening the ability. So Avatar's brilliant use of power crawl and power levels is largely due to what it doesn't do, rather than what it does do. From the start of the series, we know exactly what sort of abilities people will have with the bending of various elements, and what sort of abilities they can achieve. Even though other specialties like lightning, metal bending, and blood bending are introduced later, they're plausible extensions of existing abilities. The series is also very clear in its direction. Aang has to defeat the Fire Nation and must do this by mastering all 4 elements. The power call itself is built into the story and it's finite. It's not as if the series says, Aang must defeat the Fire Nation by getting stronger, because that's intangible and vague. When Aang achieves the power he set out to achieve, the series ends. But there's something else to Avatar's power core that makes it so fantastic. Each increase in power has a serious significance to the series and the character of Aang. Not only is each season of the show dedicated to a specific element, but Aang has to grow both emotionally and physically with each one he learns. And you know what? I don't really even blame shows like Korra and Naruto that have terrible power core. I mean, if someone came to you every week asking for a new chapter in your action serial and you had to keep the tension up, there's only so many places you could go before you ended up with this.